I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Noel Clement OAM. Jackie and I had the privilege of hearing Noel speak at a luncheon not that long ago about his activities and his work, which led me to think he'd be a fantastic speaker for our club. So he very kindly agreed to come along and devote his time to talk to us today. He's very much involved with not-for-profit organisations and has been involved with them for over 34 years. And one of the main areas in which he is involved is with refugees and community involvement with refugees. So he will speak no doubt about that today, but also a variety of areas in which he's interested. And one of the major ones is a very important one to us, and that's the SES, the emergency services. So would you like to give Noel a big protest welcome?
Thank you, David, and great to see you all, great to be here. My presentation today, I am relying on the presentation that David saw last time, but I will emphasise different aspects. So it was done in the context of the school actually that both David and I attended, Parade College, so I've got some sort of content of what took me into community work and community development, but then I am happy to go deeper on any of the areas that might be of particular interest. So we might just move on. Do I click? You click? So we'll move on to maybe the next one. Maybe on to the next slide. So just okay. So as I said, I went to Parade College, not far away. So I grew up out in Hurstbridge. My family moved out there from the inner city. So I bussed it to Parade and joined a group called Edmund Rice Society, which was a volunteer group within the school that worked largely with people with intellectual disabilities. So I used to go out to Turinga, just out in Greensboro, many of you may know it, and on Monday nights would run activities with they were children. It was a school as well as a home, run activities out there. And then later in schooling went to Janefield Training Centre that again, many of you may remember, no longer exists in Bundoora, just across the paddocks from Parade. Was a bit more confronting because that was the days of institutions and it was very much an institutional setting for people with intellectual disabilities. A number of the people that I remember working with were non-verbal and living in fairly locked environments. So that was fairly confronting. But my approach to wanting to work with community at that time came very much from that sort of charitable model of wanting to help people that I thought were less advantaged, and came very much from a more caring, help, charity sort of model. So I might shift on to the next slide, if that's okay, Bruce. But that shifted fairly significantly. I knew I wanted to do something working with people. I became a social worker. A lot of people enter social work from that real helping sort of perspective, often wanting to do good but not really understanding the nature of the work and the nature of situations that put people in touch with social workers in the first place. So coincidentally, I travelled a very short distance across the road from Parade, just down the road, to what was then Phillip Institute, now part of the RMIT campus, but it was its own separate institute at the time, and it was a 4-year social work degree. In many ways for me, it was a very transformative experience because it completely reshaped how I saw social issues, how I saw communities, and how I saw the reasons that people come in contact with social workers. So I'm not dissing charitable work. In fact, I'll come back to it. I spent a lot of time in the charitable sector. But it gave me a much more critical sort of perspective of what goes on in society and why some people have, some people don't, and the sorts of issues of discrimination, racism and other issues that exist in our society. I was fortunate, it was a 4-year course. It had a very strong focus on the sector, so I was able to do 3 placements. So effectively I spent about 9 months of the course in community service organisations. First was actually out in Broadmeadows at what was then Broadmeadows Community Health Service, doing a community video project, which was largely, exploring the different supports and assistance available to people in the community and producing a video for the community health service. That gave me a taste for community health, and I'll come back to it, but that was my sort of plan coming out of social work, was to get into community health. My second placement was at Brunswick Council, so I'm dating myself talking about separate councils. You will remember them all individually. So I worked in the aged care area of Brunswick Council for a few months, doing aged care assessments and working with the team that did Meals on Wheels, home help, etc. there. And then my final year placement was actually at Victorian Council of Social Service. And it was a very sort of policy focused placement, very much on driving social change, looking at how do we reform our policies, our work as community to try and improve the situation for people who largely are experiencing poverty. So that whole period of 4 years absolutely transformed how I saw the work that I was doing, why I came into social work, and I came out a very different person to what I'd gone in with. I didn't lose the sort of social justice angle that I'd gone in with. I didn't lose my sense of wanting to help people, but it became, in some ways, more radicalised, frankly, more action-focused. I was a bit of a rat bag coming out of that course, which I'll talk to in a minute. But very much, as you do often with university, came out with a very strong sort of theoretical framework of what was happening, what was wrong with society, and in many ways quite idealistic. So I might come on to the next one, Bruce. Thanks. One of the things about the social work course that I did, and coincidentally I'll come back to it, but full circle, I'm teaching in that course now. One of the things that course did for me was really steer me away from big institutional sort of work. So I had no desire to go and work in those big institutions. I did go for a job at Royal Park when it was a psychiatric hospital. Thank my lucky stars I didn't get the job. I didn't want to work in child protection, very important work, but it's a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation, certainly back in those days. There are lots of excellent workers in child protection, but that's not where I thought I could make the biggest difference. So I really wanted to get into community health, as I mentioned, and in those days, you might remember community health centres were standalone, multidisciplinary services that had one social worker, a physiotherapist, a podiatrist, an occupational therapist, all trying to work in a very holistic manner with community and thinking about what are those, what I call the social determinants of health, what are the things that keep us in good health and well-being that are really about how we live, how we operate as a society, and very preventative focused, so very health promotion focused. That's where I wanted to go because I'd had a taste of that. But in those days you couldn't get a job straight out of uni in community health. So I chose instead actually to go into community development on a large public housing estate in North Richmond, which is still there. And again, look, coming out of Pitt social work, yes, I was, fairly radicalised in my sort of view of things, but I was also very idealistic and had all these sorts of thoughts that communities would be ready to work with me and want to change their circumstances and really get together and push for change. And I went into the high-rise estate there, which was probably 75–80% Indo-Chinese, so Vietnamese refugees, East Timorese refugees. There was a fair number of people who'd been there, Anglo background, public housing tenants who'd been there for decades, and then there were a smattering of other communities as well. And the whole purpose of the Tenants' Council, as it was called then, was actually about tenants taking control of management of the estate. So it was very much up my alley in how I saw community work. So it's what we refer to as sort of bottom up. It's the community being able to lead rather than being told constantly what to do, create their own solutions, be able to advocate for the sorts of change they want to. So all of that was fantastic for me from a sort of perspective of what I thought I might be able to achieve. My naivety was communities aren't always that ready to engage, in more critical action. People who are dealing with poverty, who are dealing with significant issues, are surviving day to day. So their focus is on day-to-day survival and, what do I need to do today? What do I need to do next? There were some people who were very ready to get together, and a lot of work had already been done on that estate. But there was also a lot of apathy. There were communities, I mentioned Indo-Chinese communities. A lot of my talk around, community leading, community advocating, demanding change, for them sounded a bit like communism that they had fled from. So it was more Confucius, sort of master servant, teacher student. No, we want the government to tell us what to do. So that challenged my naivety in how do I work. But it was a really formative. I was only there a couple of years, but a really formative couple of years for me, in a sense, to cut my teeth, to become much more pragmatic and realistic about what I could achieve, but not to lose, I guess, my broader analysis of what was going on in society. That has never shifted for me. So 35, 40 years now since I started social work, that analysis of society and what drives poverty and discrimination, etc., is still pretty strong for me. I became much more pragmatic in how do you deal with it, what can you do, and how do you get communities involved. And frankly, working from where communities are at was pretty simple, but first lesson. Some of the stories here, again, happy to come back to any of it. So these were my bosses. So that was me in the background. So my Tenants' Council was a group of about 8 or 10 tenants that had been elected to sit like a local government council, but on the estate. They would make decisions about what we focused on. There was me and one other worker, Long Huynh, who I think's out of the image there, who was a Vietnamese man. I was the only one with community development, sort of social work training, and I was 22. I was a bit of a rat bag, thought I knew what I was doing, and I had a really mixed bag of people that I was working with on the estate. Some, as I said, had been there for a long time. This woman, Stephanie here, was learning Sanskrit and was highly educated. Very different mix of people. So I learned a lot about who lives on public housing estates. I learned a lot about community because there was this sense for people, and for me prior to that public housing estates were hellholes, they were places people didn't want to live. This was a thriving community. These were people who loved living on this estate. It had a lot of advantages. Stephanie's apartment, I remember, in building 106, my office was underneath it. Fantastic view over East Melbourne to the city. Fantastic transport access. A lot of great things. A lot of problems with the buildings, and that's what this was about, was government had promised to make upgrades to the facilities as part of an election and then was backtracking. So we did advocate. We got involved with our local member. These were the days of, was an ALP government at the time, Dimitri Dollis was our local member. Were the days when you could go to the local member, you could organise public meetings. So we'd have public meetings of tenants, we'd get 200 or 300 people there. You'd get the local member there, you'd get the councillors there. You'd push, you'd get some change happening. And the development on Elizabeth Street did happen coming out of that. There was a problem with lifts. If there was a fire, there were only 2 lifts in the building. So we were trying to get some action done on that. Yum Yup was living on the estate, young East Timorese woman who's now a leader in the East Timorese community in Australia. We wanted to get her onto council at one stage because we thought that was a way to have influence locally. That estate was about a quarter of Richmond's population, but got nothing from the council. So we naively again thought we'll get someone onto council. We actually lost, I think it was about 90 votes after preferences. In the end, it was probably the best outcome because the local member from the council for that ward, who happened also, they're ALP, but there's a whole lot of detail that I will never understand about party politics. Never wanted to be part of party politics. But they were people who previously lived on the estate and thought they still represented the estate, didn't recognise it had moved on a lot. But what that gave us was then they were prepared to meet with us. So they came and met with us every month with the Tenants' Council. So we had influence. We didn't have to support a councillor directly. So it wasn't the outcome we thought we wanted, it was probably a better outcome. And then I did end up in community health, which is over on the right, again, me being a bit of a ratbag. They were the days when, you know, I guess you just sort of, you know, jump in boldly. I was asked one day to be on the back of a ute that's the side of Bob Hawke's office in Coburg. There's a coffin there which says RIP ALP policies. And because I was very skinny, they decided I could be recession Santa who'd lost a lot of weight. So I'll tell you, it was early 90s, tells you time period knowing it's recession. So yeah, I learned a lot, and for most of the rest of my working life, I've always had a photo of that estate in North Richmond on my desk where I work, because I want that to ground me all the time, to coming back to, you know, those first realisations. I haven't got a lot on my slides about community health, but I'm happy to come back to it. I'll just say I did 11 years in community health. I was there as a sole social worker. I had 4 bilingual workers, Greek, Italian, Turkish and Arabic, working with me. And then within 2 years, Jeff Kennett came in Victoria. The world of not-for-profit sector and communities, councils changed, as you'll well remember. So there was a lot of mergers of community health services. We went from a standalone, I was on the Belt, only we're on Bell Street, 93 Bell Street is where I was, the Coburg Community Health Centre. We merged with Brunswick, then we took over, you know, northern Moreland area, became Moreland Community Health Service. And as we grew, I moved into management roles, first team leadership, then more senior roles. So within about probably 7 or 8 years, I'd moved out of a lot of direct service role into much more policy, leadership, advocacy, which is how I spent a lot of my career. But again, community health was in the community. It was embedded. You know, my board were all local community residents. It was the days when residents would come in and would just, it'd be a drop-in centre. People would drop in, have a coffee, they'd do a wander and say hello to people in their offices. Very different community service environment to what we've got now with screens and locked doors and having to have appointments to see anybody. So we might move forward, thanks, Bruce. And as I said, I'm happy to come back. So I spent 11 years in community health. And as I said, the world of small community organisations had changed radically. So I'd gone from a 2 staff member organisation to a, I think, 15 staff member organisation in community health, which grew to about 150, I think, by the time I left. I, by this time, had decided to go and do a master's. And I did my master's in social policy at RMIT. So PIT had become part of RMIT. The social work course that I did was now at RMIT. And I was being encouraged to go and do an MBA or do something like that. And I don't know at the time that I was really clear on why I was resisting that. But I know in hindsight, very much now, for me, study, these jobs, all these things for me are a pathway to trying to achieve change. They're not the end in themselves. So I didn't want to just learn about organisations. I didn't want to just learn how to do budgets. I wanted to maintain my critical thinking about society. So I did a master's with social policy and community service management that in a sense, you know, I'll use the word re-radicalised me, not in the scary radicalising sort of space, but it did re-challenge me and reset how I saw society, because I'd been in the sector at this stage for 12 years or so. And you become very pragmatic. You start to just go along with, you know, the wave and just get used to the way things are. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to unsettle myself and wanted to challenge myself. And really from then forward, my sort of mantra with my work has always been, how do I do myself out of a job? What needs to change so that social workers don't need to be here? And I'm not, again, I bring some more deliberate idealism now to it. I'm still very pragmatic, and you'll hear that, and there'll be people who criticise me for being too much about incremental change, etc. Because I'm not someone who wants to wait for the revolution to come, and I have no confidence that revolutions necessarily make things better anyway. So I am very much about how do we change the system we're in. But I want to maintain that really critical focus and, in effect, you know, put my feet to the flames and challenge myself whether or not I'm just being complicit. Did my master's and needed to do something different. So I actually took a 9-month job at Red Cross. I couldn't decide what I wanted to do. I was at that point in my career where I'd been managing all the social and community services in Moreland Community Health before I left. There was a career sort of trajectory for me into leadership, CEO type roles. But you know, a bit like doing the MBA, content's really important to me. The work that we do is really what it's all about for me. So I didn't want to lose touch with that. So I wanted to find a way that I could still be working in human services, still have, you know, a big role in that change, but recognise that probably my skills and where I was at, I was going to be better in more leadership sort of positions. So I went into Red Cross with a 9-month job working on a thing called the Asylum Seeker Assistance Program. Coincidentally, 90% of the people on that program were East Timorese, because the East Timorese had been in the country for 10 years and their visa status had not been resolved. They were here supposedly temporarily. This scheme was established to provide support to them. It was like a mirror of Medicare and Centrelink that we ran. So we gave fortnightly income support and paid for health services. Only up to 90%. There was always this thing they can't get as much as citizens would get. So I went in there for 9 months and I left about 20 years later. I'm a state, I will say that. So asylum seekers has really been a big part of my work since then. I've worked with refugees since my very first job, but in terms of a focus for my work, it was going into Red Cross that it really became a big part of what I've done since. Disasters as well, I was there for that first 9 months, and then they did a bit of a restructure, and I got this job that was managing all the asylum seeker refugee work and also managing disasters. I was managing first aid, and I was managing youth programs. I'd done youth programs before, you know, had no experience specifically in disasters, and unfortunately had to cut my teeth on the Bali Bombings, which many of you will remember, you all remember, I'm sure. So I was responsible for the Bali appeal, which went to hell in a handbasket. Again, I'm happy to go into any of this in more detail. I was responsible for the 2010 Black Saturday bushfires appeal, which was about, I think Bali was about 15 million. I think the Black Saturday one was 300 or 400 million. I supported the international team with the Indian Ocean tsunami appeal. So a lot of my work over a number of years became very large fundraising appeals, distribution, how do we provide support to people impacted by disasters, as well as starting to, I went to Red Cross at a time when they had been running very much as 8 separate state and territory organisations, and we were very much trying to, I was in the national office, trying to look at how does Red Cross really have impact across Australia, because it has amazing access and potential that a lot of other organisations didn't have. It's an apolitical organisation, it's not religious, you know, it's embedded in communities, its lifeblood is volunteers, It's trusted, it's got an amazing brand, it connects to an international movement. So I spent a lot of that next 20 years trying to help reshape what Red Cross was doing, trying to look at how Red Cross has a bigger impact. Again, with asylum seekers, refugees and disasters being the two tracks that I was responsible for my whole time there. But in the end, I ended up, the last few years, so I had a whole lot of roles. I moved into more senior leadership roles. But in the end, the last few years before I left, I was director of programs, so I led all of the work we did across Australia. So I had all of the program heads reporting through to me, as well as all the state and territory directors. So it was only the international program that wasn't reporting directly to me, but I was responsible for the work we did in refugees and asylum seekers internationally. So I'd taken on a lot of responsibility. I saw a lot of my work as how do I protect and enable and support good work to happen, because I was no longer practicing as a community worker, a social worker, but I was in a strong position to be able to support and encourage and enable people to do good work. So we did a lot of work around monitoring the conditions of detention. So I visited Manus Island, Nauru, Christmas Island, all the major detention centres. We did a lot of work following every disaster. We worked with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. We worked with older people through programs like Telecross, very diverse range of things the Red Cross did and still does. And the scandal thing, a bit of the bookend for me with Red Cross, as I said, 9 months in, I managed the Bali appeal, which I describe as going to hell in a handbasket, but that was more the media response. There were some mistakes made, but I am comfortable in a large part with what we did. I learned a lot from it, so the way we did those other appeals was very different. But the end of my time there was the Big Black Summer bushfires appeal in 2019, which absolutely erupted in terms of media attention, and that was me on the Channel 9 Today Show, I think it was, with Karl Stefanovic telling me he wasn't going to get aggressive, but getting stuck into me. And then I was the witness for Red Cross for the Royal Commission into bushfires. So during COVID, I had the opportunity, I guess, character building opportunity to present, I think it was 3 times publicly with the Royal Commission. I was there on day 2 of the Royal Commission, not knowing what the Royal Commission's intention was, and having had lawyers basically prepare me for, they're after you, just, answer, what you're asked and nothing more. And the heart of me is a community worker, social worker that wants to explain and wants people to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And media. I've done a lot of media by this stage. In the media, you try and be as open and honest and, answer the question and help people understand what you're doing. Royal Commissions are very different, I discovered. Well, certainly the way lawyers prepare you for Royal Commissions is very different. They weren't after us. Now, I could have made a mess of it if I'd just taken my own counsel, so always take counsel from those with much more experience and knowledge than me. But we came through the Royal Commission fairly well. A lot of recommendations from that Royal Commission, like all Royal Commissions, mostly not implemented. But again, in terms of the bushfire appeal, some of the things that we were being attacked about, this was 3 weeks in, was basically that we didn't have the $400 million already in people's pockets. Again, I can go into this in more detail. The reality is we didn't have all the $400 million in, for starters, and secondly, it takes people a long time, those most impacted, it can take them a long time to come forward for help. So we don't chase people in hospitals and on their blocks trying to get them to take money because we're ready to give money. And the third thing, which again comes from my strong social justice angle, there was always a bit of a narrative that it's simple, you've got to do is work out how many people lost their houses, divide the money by that many people, done. And it takes no account of people's capacity to recover and the very different experiences of people who've got full insurance or no insurance. People who have families, maybe with children with disabilities, living on disability support pension versus people who have dual incomes. We didn't means test it, but we absolutely looked at people's capacity to recover and tried to make sure that larger amounts went to people to get them back on their feet, not just this assumption that everybody needs exactly the same. Everybody got something. There was no issue with that. Might keep moving, sorry, Bruce. So just a couple more slides and then I'm happy to dive into any specific areas. Because Red Cross is a global organisation, I have had some amazing opportunities through my career. As I mentioned, the Indian Ocean tsunami. I wasn't part of the international team, but because I'd managed the Bali appeal, I was closely involved in sort of managing some of the risks and how do we, do this the best way we possibly can while sticking to our principles. I ended up going to Banda Aceh and Malabo, which is parts of the very top of Sumatra that were hit by the tsunami 3 weeks after the tsunami, and was part of negotiating the projects that we as Australian Red Cross would fund because we had hundreds of millions of dollars. I got to visit Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans 12 months after Hurricane Katrina happened, and so American Red Cross I'd had a bit of involvement with. They'd supported us with Bali. Again, I'm happy to come back to it. The difference, I talk about this to students when I'm teaching community work, the difference between these two was dramatic. Within 3 weeks, basically Banda Aceh was moonscaped. The military had come in and completely cleared it. Within 12 months, that's how New Orleans still looked. Completely different approach, neither of which I would support. Both had huge, huge problems. But America, it's when it really first struck me just how different a society America is, where even American Red Cross was shocked when the Australians and Europeans that were on the travel trip that I was on were all a bit surprised, where was your government? Why is it looking like this? Why isn't government doing something? Because a lot of people, largely poor black neighbourhoods that had got hit, had been shipped out to Dallas, Fort Worth, various other places. There was no plan to bring them back. That's people's individual responsibility. Even our bus driver from American Red Cross took us past his house. He spent all his weekends cleaning mud out of his house with no help. We couldn't fathom it as Australians, and the Europeans couldn't fathom it either. But he was very much in that American, everyone can be a millionaire, but also everyone, needs to stand on their own 2 feet, and the state or government's not responsible for you. So I learned a lot about, frankly, strengths of Australia and some of the approaches that we take in comparison. I was in leadership roles within Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, so I was fortunate. I was one of 3, 4, I think we had 4 co-chairs for the Migration Leadership Platform, one from the Federation Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies, one from the International Committee of Red Cross, myself and the Secretary General of the Maldivian Red Crescent at the time. So that was fantastic to drive change in the way that Red Cross, Red Crescent got involved with refugees and asylum seekers. And Red Cross, Red Crescent global conferences bring together, so Red Cross is the keepers of the Geneva Conventions. So all the governments that signed on to the Geneva Conventions and all the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies in those countries come together every 4 years. So these are massive conferences, they're like the UN, and they are opportunities to really try and get some change in government. So fantastic opportunities. Final slide, thanks Bruce. So quickly now, so I left Red Cross after 20 years of my own accord. They were doing some restructures again. I was managing 60% of the organisation. It didn't make sense for that to happen. It was happening because I'd managed all parts of it at various points. And frankly, I had been keen to take on the full role, but I understood why the organisation saw that as a bit of a risk and wanted to reshape it. They were offering me a role. It was a fantastic role they were offering me that was still managing all of the programs. But it just wasn't sitting right in my gut, and I've learnt through the years to listen to my gut. As much as I'm a stayer, I don't love change, but when change happens, normally once I accept it, I lock in. And it wasn't happening this time, so something wasn't clicking for me. So I decided to leave. No plan, against all the advice everyone gave me, decided to leave. I managed to have an accident at home. So a typical man injury, fell off a ladder. I was getting bitten by European wasps at the time. But I tore my patella tendon in 3 places, a really freaky injury, and it gave me permission just to stop. I was in a leg brace for 4 months, but I just stopped and decided what I wanted to do was continue. Firstly, I knew I wasn't done. I was only 56 at the time. I knew I wasn't done, but I didn't want to just jump straight back into another big job. I still didn't particularly need to be a CEO. So it gave me time to plan, how do I continue to have impact, how do I continue to contribute without having to have the big job. I won't lie that LinkedIn is not a good place for me, because I do still have an ego, and there is still that little sort of voice in my head, what I should and could be doing, and I have various people with great ambitions for what I could do next. So I challenged myself in that, because humility is also very important to me, and challenge myself to stick to basically go where I feel I can make a difference and where people value what I bring. So that's what I've been doing. So first thing I did was I was invited by someone I'd worked with, a woman called Libby Lloyd, to join the board of Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia. I sort of had a hint of, but didn't quite know that I was perhaps part of her exit plan. She's an amazing woman, has an amazing number of other things, but I was very pleased to be able to take on the chair role, I think about 6 months later. So I've been doing that for nearly 4 years now. I wanted to keep a foot in the disaster space, so I applied to be a member of the State Emergency Service. I deliberately didn't seek a role in Red Cross, because I'd been at a senior leadership role, and I really thought it's not a good idea when organisations are going through a lot of change to be the person in the background going, I wouldn't have done that. So I deliberately haven't, I've kept in contact with people, but I deliberately haven't sought to be involved that I'd like to at some stage in the future. But State Emergency Service has a lot of things that are very familiar: volunteers, emergency focus, great long-standing organisation. So I've just been reappointed to that for my second term. I mentioned Pitt and RMIT. I've done a full circle. So I did my social work there, went back and did my master's, and now I just threw my hat in the ring to be a tutor. And it happened that someone who was working there knew me from my days in community health. We'd worked from one of the migrant resource centres, and someone else there also knew me from Red Cross. So I was plucked out of the list, and I really didn't know when I first started, this is my 4th year, whether it was really going to add value, was going to add enough value for me, because a lot of students don't come to tutorials. That's what I'm doing. I'm going to tutorials. I'm not lecturing. I go to tutorials. I am the face that they have contact with in the teaching team, because all the lectures pretty much are online. They do their readings. And I first went, only about half students turn up. And then I started to see some feedback from the students, and I just locked into what could I offer that the teaching team couldn't. And it's not retraining as an academic, no desire to do a PhD, no desire to rebuild a career in academia. But it was my experience bringing my social work, as well as having done the leadership work, as well as understanding communities. It's that sort of 35, 40 years of experience that they just don't get a lot of. they're amazing teachers, amazing people, but a lot of people who tutor are studying themselves or, you know, got pathways into academia or are earlier in their career. So I started to lock on. So I teach in community work. In fact, one of the things I'm about to this week mark assignments around community work. It's bringing me back to my roots. And, you know, originally I thought, I've been out of practice for so long, but I remember then how much I brought social work into all the work that I've done. That's the lens I've looked at everything that I've done through. So I teach now in the undergraduate as well as the master's program. You know, I've worked out, again, the students to really, not the students to focus on, but the students who really engage. That's where I get my sort of payback. And I'm learning, because this is, again, that sort of re-radicalised me. This is happening a third time in my career. This is re-engaging me with theory and re-engaging what we sort of call my critical muscle, to really thinking about what's going on in society and what change is still needed. And then a bit of a square peg in a round hole. I'm part of a group called Social Impact Hub, which is Sydney-based, that works more with social enterprises, social entrepreneurs, does a lot of things around impact investing. So I'm heading home from here to do a mentor session with them. They have a fellowship program a couple of times a year, and I'm always on a panel at the start of that, which is, you know, what does impact mean? And I drive a really strong sort of community focus to impact, whereas a lot of the other people will drive much more of a social enterprise focus. And then I've done some work with the Victorian Electoral Commission around advocacy, and that's me. So I'm very happy to take questions on any of that, but I'll probably run over time already.
No, that's fine. That's terrific. So. Terrific. Now, any questions that anyone would like to ask Noel? Yeah.
So I've never worked out what's the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee.
Sure. So a refugee is someone who has already been assessed to meet the definition of refugee, United Nations definition. So you need to be out of your country of origin. Your country of origin needs to be incapable of protecting you, and you need to have a well-founded fear of persecution for a range of reasons, you know, race, religion, political opinion. So asylum seekers have left their country, but no one's yet assessed whether they actually meet that definition of a refugee. So typically, refugees might arrive in a refugee camp and get assessed by the United Nations, or they arrive as an asylum seeker in a country like Australia, and then Australia assesses whether they meet the definition of refugee. They're the same thing, one's been recognised, the other hasn't yet. Not all asylum seekers will be recognised to be refugees. That doesn't mean they don't need protection, because the refugee definition is also quite narrow. It's very narrow, so that's why it becomes quite contentious, but I'm not a refugee lawyer, but the refugee lawyers will tell you that it's important to protect what a refugee is, so really define that. But then we talk about complementary protection. Sometimes there are other groups that also need protection that don't meet that definition. But yeah, asylum seekers are largely people who've arrived who haven't yet been assessed.
Okay, anything else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In regards to the machete-wielding African gangs, or that's a term that the media uses, not my term.
Yeah.
Is the parents not able to control the children? Are they totally unable to handle them?
So a couple of things I'd say. I mean, one, I'm not from that community, I don't work with that community, but I have colleagues who are from and work with that community. And firstly, I'd say, and I've learned a lot from my own experience around disasters, be very careful of the way that media frames things and the media narrative around things. We only need to go back through waves of migration and go back to the Irish in the early days of Australian colonisation to see the same sorts of things being labelled at various groups. So all new and emerging communities can struggle with adaptation to a new environment. African communities have been in Australia since the 90s. They are becoming quite established communities, and there are amazing entrepreneurs, amazing contributors. Second thing I'd say, it is perhaps easier for people to physically identify somebody and then make an assumption about what's going on. Because the flip side of this is I also hear stories about groups of African people who say they can't travel into town together because if they do, they'll be perceived to be a gang. So there's a whole lot of stuff about the narrative about gangs that's hugely problematic. That's not to say in any community there aren't some bad apples that make bad decisions, and not to say that there aren't some issues intergenerationally in some families, but I don't know those families to know individually what's going on. Very concerned about knife crime and violence, etc. I'd need to have a look at the statistics to say, is it actually growing or is there a perception that it's growing? Because I genuinely don't know myself. I haven't dug into it enough. But yeah, I know what the narrative is, and I always question when I hear those sorts of narratives.
Okay, thanks, Noel. Anything else? All right, well, Noel, thank you very much for sharing your career with us. A fascinating career where you're involved in a lot of challenges, and I'm sure there are plenty more challenges ahead.
A lot of rewards with it, believe me.
Being the person you are, you'll move from one challenge to another, but we really appreciate you coming along and sharing that experience with us today. You have a lot on your plate, but we've got a little something here that we hope might help you to relax.
I'm sure it will.
And enjoy. But could we show our appreciation?